From 1965, the Byrds with their classic recording of Mr. Tambourine Man. Roger McGuinn's distinctive 12-string electric is the sound of the Byrds, and he led the group from 1965 to 1971, and along the way, songs like Mr. Tambourine Man, Turn, 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 8 Miles High, Mr. Spaceman, So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star. Those songs were, and I know it's a cliche, but in this case it's true, those songs were the soundtrack to a generation. Rock and Roll Hall of Famer Roger McGuinn is our guest today on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop, and he's got some shows coming up in our area. One on April 25th at the Mount Hebron Theater. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Sounds right to me.
In Montclair, New Jersey. Roger, welcome to the show, and what kind of shows will these be? Are these going to be acoustic shows or electric shows?
Well, a little bit of both. I bring 4 instruments. My electric Rickenbacker 12-string, a 12-string acoustic guitar, a 7-string acoustic guitar, and a 5-string banjo. And I tell stories and sing songs, kind of like the format Pete Seeger used to do back in his concerts, where he'd set up the song with a story and then play the song. And then the whole show is kind of an autobiographical story.
I see. So similar in a way to your Live from Mars album from some years back.
Yeah, well, I have different shows that I do depending on where I've played and what I've done recently, but there are lots of different ways to set up songs. I do play the same songs, some of them like Turn, Turn, Turn and Mr. Tambourine Man, because I'm pretty sure people want to hear those, but my introductions change from show to show.
You know, I think most everyone associates you with the worlds of folk and folk rock music, but I'm a huge Bobby Darin fanatic, and I know that when you were first starting out, before the Byrds, that you worked with Bobby Darin. How did the two of you get together? Well,
I was playing with the Chad Mitchell Trio. We had just returned from a 90-day tour of South America, and I was playing at the Crescendo Club in L.A., opening up for Lenny Bruce, and Bobby was in the audience. And I backed up the Chad Mitchell Trio. I wasn't allowed to sing because there were 3 guys who sang and didn't play any instruments, and I played guitar and banjo behind them. So Bobby liked what I was doing, and he approached me after the show. He said, I'm thinking about putting a folk segment into my act, and I'd like to hire you. And I said, well, I've already got a job with the Chad Mitchell Trio. And he asked me what they were paying. And I told him, he said, I'll double it. So I said, okay. So that's how I got to work with Bobby. And what I did with him was I didn't do the rock and roll hits or the Frank Sinatra kind of stuff. I did folk music in the middle of the show. He put about a 15-minute folk music segment into the middle of the show. And I would come out and play 12-string guitar and sing harmony with him. And it was a great experience. We traveled all over the country doing that until he got ill. He'd had rheumatic fever when he was young, and his heart, in fact, he collapsed on stage one night. So his doctor told him to take a break from performing it. So that was the end of my performing with him. But I continued to work with him as a songwriter in the Brill Building. He hired me as a songwriter, and we worked together for a while doing that.
Interesting. I know that during those Brill Building years for you that you recorded under the name The City Surfers, and there was a song called Beach Ball. Was Bobby Darin involved with that record?
Yes, he was. I co-wrote it, and I took it down to Bobby and showed it to him, and he loved it. He called up the studio, and we recorded it that day, and he played drums on it and sang in the background. He didn't want his voice to be in the front, but it was Frank Gehry and I sang the lead, and we clapped our hands and sang harmonies, and I played guitar, and Frank played piano, and Bobby played drums, and we called ourselves the City Surfers.
The City Surfers, 1963, featuring Roger McGuinn and an uncredited Bobby Darin on background vocals and drums. Roger McGuinn is our guest today on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. That song was kind of a Beach Boys type of track, and people laugh because I always ask about the Beach Boys. But when you were getting the harmonies together for the Byrds, were the Beach Boys an influence?
Oh, yeah, definitely. We were influenced by the Beach Boys and the Everly Brothers and, of course, the Beatles. who were influenced by those people as well. So there was a lot of stuff going on that was kind of crossing over, a lot of cross-pollination.
And obviously the Beatles changed the face of music and sort of set the template for what the Byrds would look like and sound like.
Well, it was an awakening for me. I'd been a folk singer, and I'd watched folk music get really big to the point where it kind of collapsed under its own weight. And then the Beatles came out and totally destroyed the market for folk music. But they were using folk music chord changes in their rock and roll. So that gave me the idea of combining folk and rock.
And of course, the Beatles would eventually follow that lead and also get into their Dylan-esque material, like You've Got to Hide Your Love Away and so on.
Yeah, they didn't do that initially. You know, they did love songs like She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand. And I remember after I met the Beatles, George told me they had a meeting with Bob. And he said, you guys, you know, you have this big platform, but you're not saying anything. Why don't you write some songs that have some meaning? And then they started doing that after that.
We just heard the Byrds and their cover of Bob Dylan's My Back Pages. Our guest today is Roger McGuinn, formerly of the Byrds. And Roger, I'd like to ask you about Gene Clark, because by the time that song that we just heard was recorded, My Back Pages, Gene Clark had left the Byrds. But I noticed on some TV appearances, he'd be gone for a while, then he would come back and do a couple of shows, and I know that in 1971, the Byrds recorded another Gene Clark original song. So although he had left the group, it doesn't seem like there were many hard feelings there.
No, there were no hard feelings between the Byrds and Gene Clark. He left, and the initial time he left was because of fear of flying. We were headed from Los Angeles to New York for a Murray the K special, and I got on the plane almost when they were closing the doors, and Gene was in a cold sweat, standing up in the aisle, shaking and saying, I got to get off this plane, man, I got to get off this plane. And we were just hoping he wasn't psychic because, but the plane made it to New York, and we did the Murray the K special, but Gene was out of the Byrds. I said, if you can't fly, you can't be a bird. And that was it. And then David Crosby left, so we asked Gene to come back for a while, but he still had the trouble with traveling. He would take the train, or we did fly some, but he was just a nervous wreck on planes. So the story goes that he'd seen a plane crash in Kansas when he was young, and it's kind of stayed with him for life.
Well, speaking of Gene Clark and yourself and David Crosby, the three of you collaborated on a song called 8 Miles High, a big hit, obviously. Anybody listening to the show knows the song. But certainly when it was released in 1966, the public at large just assumed it was a song about drugs, but that really wasn't the case.
Yeah, well, we were smoking pot and everything, and taking LSD. So I guess it's a natural assumption that the song would be about that. But we were really talking about a trip to England and the altitude of the plane. Gene Clark asked me how high the plane was flying coming back from England. And I said, probably 39,000 feet, like 7 miles high. And he said, 7, huh? Because the Beatles had a song out called 8 Days a Week. And so I said, well, who's going to care? We'll change it to 8, poetic license. Well, I was wrong, because when the radio guys got a hold of it, they did the math and said, wait a minute. Airplanes don't fly, commercial planes don't fly 8 miles high. They must be talking about some other kind of high.
We're talking to Roger McGuinn, formerly of the Byrds, and he's got a show coming up April 25th in Montclair, New Jersey at the Mount Hebron Theater. I hope I've got that right. I'm going to get some angry emails probably if I don't. But Roger, we're playing these songs here, 8 Miles High. We started off with Mr. Tambourine Man. We're talking about all this incredible music. I mean, it's a heck of a legacy, and it's certainly something that you've got to be proud of, obviously. Are there any regrets?
Well, I guess we didn't need to do the drugs. I don't think they really inspired us. They just probably made us think we were doing better than we were. I would change that if I could go back and, talk to myself and say, hey, cut that out.
Some of this music has been reassessed. It's interesting how perceptions change. Over the years, certain albums become more popular than other albums, and I think now the notorious Byrd Brothers is starting to get a lot of attention. I think that album has been long overdue for a reassessment as one of the best albums in the Byrds catalog.
I really love Notorious Byrd Brothers. I love the way it flows, and of course it's kind of Beatle inspired. I forget which Beatle album preceded it. Was it Rubber Soul? I don't know. It was one of those.
Yeah.
But we were definitely playing catch up with the Beatles and trying to do something creative. And I love the way it flows with the sound effects and the phase shifting and things that we did, putting classical orchestras into certain parts of it. And it was really a fun album to record.
Yeah, there's a lot of great music here and a lot of different styles. I mean, a song like Old John Robertson is sort of a psychedelic country track. Of course, on the next album, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, that's when everyone says, oh, the Byrds went country on that album. But those influences were there before that.
Oh, yeah, we dabbled in even if you go back to the second album, Turn, 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 you find Satisfied Mind and I forget what, but we were dabbling in country before we did Sweetheart, but we didn't go whole hog into it until the Sweetheart of the Rodeo.
Roger, you had a reputation for being a techie long before the term techie existed, and you've seen the way that the music industry has changed with new technology and the internet and downloading. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm all for it. I've always been a big fan of technology, as you said. And because my grandfather was an engineer in Chicago, he used to take me to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago all the time. And that's even at a young age, like three years old, I got into pushing buttons and watching things light up and whir and go around. So what happened back with Napster was very destructive to the established music business. And they didn't know how to cope with it. And their knee-jerk reaction was to sue kids for their college money, which I didn't approve of at all.
Right.
And I went on record with the Senate and said, hey, you guys embrace it. You can make more money if you get into it than if you try to sue people. And it's the new radio. And I even went to the point and said, you play it free on the radio. You can record it off the radio and you get a better copy than an MP3. What's your problem? Anyway, they didn't get along into it until maybe 10, 15 years later. And now we got Spotify and all the streaming stuff. And I do have one problem, though. I went back to Congress last, I think it was, maybe about 6-8 months ago. And we had to talk to them about the copyright law. There's a problem with the copyright law. It says anything recorded prior to 1972 is free on Spotify. They don't have to pay royalties. And we need to get that fixed because the Beatles and the Byrds and the Beach Boys all recorded prior to 1972. And if they're playing it on streaming media like Sirius XM radio or Spotify, they don't have to pay. It's all free to them. And that's a problem for older artists.
Wow, I didn't know anything about that. I know there are European copyright laws which don't benefit the artist, but I had no idea that streaming media doesn't pay you guys. That's crazy.
Right, we do get paid on radio from ASCAP and BMI, but we don't get paid for streaming media.
Speaking of the internet, tell us a little bit about the Folk Den project.
I started the Folk Den back in 1995. We're approaching the 20th anniversary in November. The idea was that I was listening to a traditional album on Smithsonian Folkways and realized that I wasn't hearing a lot of traditional music from the new folk singers. There were people with acoustic guitars, but they weren't doing traditional music. They're doing their own songs. And that had been a trend that started with Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell and had proliferated. Almost everybody who played acoustic music was doing their own material. So I thought, what's going to happen when Odetta dies or Pete Seeger dies? Well, they both passed on now. And who's going to keep the traditional music alive? So my wife does the business in our business, and I went to her and I said, what would you think if I were to put traditional songs up on the internet for free download? She said, oh, that's a great idea. So I started doing that in November of 1995, and so far there are 220 songs in free MP3 format you can download. And is just kind of a labor of love. It's like a global community service.
Yeah, it sounds like the 21st century version of the folk tradition, passing those songs down.
Exactly, the oral tradition. People can listen to them and play guitar along with it, or put the chords and the lyrics and a little story about the song. And it's been fun for me. I haven't. It hasn't been difficult. It's a labor of love. It's sponsored by UNC in Chapel Hill, so it's just an educational thing.
Once again, our guest today has been Roger McGuinn, and let me give you those shows again. We mentioned one, but he's got some few in the area. April 24th at the Pollock Theater in West Long Branch, New Jersey, the 25th at the Mount Hebron Theater in Montclair, New Jersey, and June 12th at the Ridgefield Playhouse in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Just Google Roger McGuinn. Just go to a search engine, type in his name, and I'm sure his website will pop up with all of those dates. Roger, thanks so much for joining us today and on this Easter Sunday. God bless you and have a great rest of your day.
Well, God bless you too, and have a great rest of your day.